Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good
We're going to wait
morning.
just a few minutes to let everybody get in and get settled. Today's talk is going to be recorded, so if y'all don't mind turning off your video and your microphone, that'll help with distractions, noise while Jewell is talking. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to address questions at the end of the talk. We're going to wait just a few more minutes. We got a lot of people signing in. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to have y'all here. Before we get to our guest speaker, I wanted to say a few words about the Phil Hardberger Park Conservancy. We are the nonprofit that supports activities and programs in the park, and we're a donation-based nonprofit. So if you enjoy programs like what we're offering today, please consider donating or becoming a member. Proceeds to that help support programs like these and bring them free to the public. Also, I mentioned before, we are going to be recording today's talk, so we ask that everybody turn off their video and their microphone. We will be accepting questions, so feel free to put them in the chat and we can address them at the end of the talk. Today we have Jewell Cozort here to talk to us about ecosystem services. Jewell is the park biologist for the natural areas in the park, and she does a great job talking about ecosystems and drought and a lot of different functions in the ecosystems in the park. Jewell, I'm going to let you take the talk.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. I have a confession. This is my first Zoom presentation, so thanks for joining us today. I also have another victory I want to share. I ran 6 miles. Running is a new journey for me, and I ran 6 miles this morning before this talk, so I'm really proud of that. And also, I'm glad I'm doing a Zoom for this presentation because I can sit down. So today I want to talk about ecosystem services. This is how we benefit from the earth. So ecosystem services define that's the goods and services provided by ecosystems that benefit, sustain, and support the well-being of people. You can also refer to it as natural capital, but benefiting the well-being of people is kind of an anthropocentric way of looking at ecosystem services. And so some people may have different opinions on that. This may be general knowledge for everyone, but I did want to go through what an ecosystem is. The ecosystem includes all the living things in a particular area. The plants, animals, and organisms, including people, interacting with each other and the elements of the non-living environment. And I have these two visuals here, one of the ocean basin or a marine ecosystem, a very large area, compared with a pothole, you know, an ephemeral pothole after a rain event. Even though it's small, it's still considered an ecosystem. So ecosystems vary enormously in size, and benefits can be obtained from any ecosystem, no matter what size. So the timeline of ecosystem services and, you know, the development of this concept in, you know, economics and the scientific field began back in the early 1800s with William Forster Lloyd. He was an economist, and he began to think about how cattle grazing on common land or public land were less fit or less healthy compared to cattle grazed on privately owned estates in England. So the differences between public and privately owned, you know, management of land became a topic of interest. And then later in the 1900s, in 1968, Garrett Hardin, an ecologist, further developed the idea of tragedy of the commons. And so what this is that if everyone respects ecosystems and grazes their cattle, is the example that's typically used, beneath or below the carrying capacity of the land, all the users will benefit. But the tragedy of the commons is that usually the individuals are going to act in their own self-interest, and they're going to, they believe they can benefit. They'll add one more cattle to their herd because it'll benefit them. But overall, the disadvantages of adding one cattle is felt by all the users of the ecosystem or the public land or the commons. And so that's the tragedy of it all, is that you know, humans will generally act in their self-interest. And eventually, with everyone doing this, without any regulation or policy or understanding among, you know, the users of the land, it will become unusable and won't support anyone at all. Fast forwarding to 1997, Robert Costanza and others wrote a paper called The Value of the World's Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital. This was one of the first articles that really propelled the concept of ecosystem services and putting a monetary value on them into the scientific and economic fields of study. And so it created a buzz, and a lot of people started researching it and developing the ideas further. And then in 2000, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment began to take place. It was called for by Kofi Annan, and it was a large publication meant to look at how ecosystems affect human well-being. And this next slide here is another timeline, but it's really just to show that it's been developing over time, and there's a lot of people that have contributed to it and a lot of different things that have happened since, you know, the development of ecosystem services and its movement into more of the policy and decision-making aspect of our world. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, I wanted to just dive into that again. It was called for by the General Kofi Annan in 2000 and published in 2005. And so the main objective was to look at how ecosystem change will have consequences on human well-being and establish the scientific basis for actions to enhance the conservation of and sustainable use of ecosystems. So this is one of the main resources that you can find on the development of ecosystem services, and some of the more, you know, theoretical topics we'll talk about that define ecosystem services and putting a value on them. So one of the main resources here. So if you want to just Google it and research this topic more, there's a lot of information out there. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment breaks down ecosystem services into 4 broad categories. The first is what we all can really relate to, those provisioning services that provide us with benefits, you know, pretty directly: food, water, wood, fuel, and fiber, even pharmaceuticals, and material for industrial products like lumber. So provisioning services, those things that we rely on. The second ecosystem services that they define are regulating services. This is local climate and air quality, carbon sequestration and storage through forests, moderation of extreme events like hurricanes or floods, wastewater treatment, decomposition of waste, preventing erosion and maintaining soil fertility, pollination, a big one, and the biological control and regulation of pests and disease. So here I have one of our most precious ecosystem services in San Antonio, the Edwards Aquifer. It stores, retains, and filters water and drinking water for everyone in our area. It's just an excellent example of how the ecosystem we live in San Antonio provides for us, and that's considered a regulating service. The next, and one that I cherish, are the cultural services that ecosystems provide. The recreation aspect, the mental and physical health, and right now especially, it's been talked about in the media and among other circles that, getting outside during our current COVID-19 situation is just one of the only ways to maintain our mental health. So right now, especially, we can really value those cultural services that ecosystems provide. Not only that, but tourism, the aesthetic appreciation and inspiration for culture and art that such a beautiful mountains and trees and animals provide inspiration to us. Then the spiritual experience that we receive from being in a beautiful wide open space or hearing the river trickle over rocks really gives us a benefit, the cultural service benefit. And then the sense of place. I really like this one as well because we're all living in the hill country, right? That's our sense of place. That's what we kind of associate where we live. You could be from the valley. You could be from, I lived in the mountains, or I'm from Appalachia. It's that sense of place that you get from where you live. And the final, fourth ecosystem service are supporting services. This is how ecosystems just behind the scenes are going to support every other service that we receive. Nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, how plants just make their own food. Just the fact that there are habitats for these services to take place. And then also genetic diversity, very important for the resiliency of ecosystems and species. So what kind of ecosystems provide ecosystem services? Well, all of them do, but here's just a slide again from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that shows how it doesn't matter if you're up in the mountains, they're gonna provide food, fresh water, climate regulation, recreation, whether you're in a inland water like a river or a wetland ecosystem, there's recreation, food, aesthetic value, disease regulation. And then even in urban parks and gardens, you have air quality regulation, water regulation, cultural heritage, and that sort of thing. All the way down to the marine ecosystems where, of course, we get a lot of benefit from fishing and recreation, of course, and climate regulation. So those four ecosystem services can further be defined or broken down as direct benefits and indirect benefits. So direct benefits, we're going to be benefiting from directly, like the provisioning services, that food, fresh water, fuel wood, biochemicals for medicine, and then the cultural ecosystem services. We certainly benefit directly from those as well, those non-material benefits. And then there's the regulating and supporting ecosystem services that we don't directly benefit from, that we can sense and feel tangibly or directly benefit from. So regulating ecosystem services and supporting ecosystem services. So with those direct ecosystem services, the ones that we benefit from directly, like provisioning services, we can go to a store and determine the value of that ecosystem service pretty readily. So provisioning ecosystem services, food, water, fuel wood, lumber. You can go to the store and buy an apple and it costs about $1.29. That's what we're willing to pay. For a 2x4 at Home Depot or Lowe's, $2.79. Your Saw's water bill, for example, or how much does a prescription drug cost? Those cultural services, those are also easy to put a monetary value on. Like how much does it cost, or how much are you willing to pay to go to Government Canyon, the entrance fee to parks? How much would you pay to buy a camera to get inspiration by taking nature photography? Or how much are you willing to pay to go to the Grand Canyon and take an ecotourism trip? But those aesthetic beauties and the aesthetic beauty and the sense of place, those are pretty priceless. And so that's when we start, it gets a little tricky to put values on. And even more tricky are putting values on those indirect ecosystem services, the ones that we do not directly benefit from, according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. The Edwards Aquifer, what is the price of that? How much does it cost? What do we value that at? It's very hard to define. The dragonfly nymph feeding on a mosquito, which is providing disease regulation. How much does that single dragonfly nymph cost? And then how much should we pay, or how much should we value the soil formation of 1 centimeter of soil, which can take like 100 years? So this is, those indirect ecosystem services are hard to put a value on. So again, because it's hard, it's undervalued. They're not traded in formal markets. When the supply or condition changes, it may not be reflected in the market. And few people, unfortunately, are conscious of the role natural ecosystems play in generating our goods. So it's hard to quantitate, right? How much, this is a satellite image of a rainforest in Brazil in 1975, pristine rainforest. In 2009, it's been converted to farmland. How much value was held in that ecosystem prior to the conversion to farmland? That water regulation, oxygen, and carbon sequestration, how much was that valued? And then now that it's converted to farmland, it's, there's habitat loss, erosion, and one point to make here is that even though it's been converted to farmland, we're still benefiting from that ecosystem. So it still has worth and benefits to people. So further, ecosystem services existed long before humanity. They're basic fundamentals of life, in our opinion, so we take them for granted. They're so large in scale that it's hard for us to imagine how we can even disrupt them, like climate. And when we do, the damage is not easily reversed on a time scale that's relevant to society. So when we mess things up, who cares? We're not gonna, won't happen in my lifetime. So these ecosystem services are hard to define, and there's some societal issues involved with their monetary values as well. So putting a price on nature is not easy, but nevertheless, several methods exist to estimate the monetary value, and these are just a few. The market price, that's the value of those provisioning services, the products that we receive that are bought and sold in commercial markets, like the value of an apple. And then the travel cost, again, that's what you would define as what someone's willing to pay to travel to a destination for recreational purpose. And then contingent valuation. How much are you willing to pay for an environmental service? How much are you willing to pay for pollination or the Edwards aquifer? And then finally, damage cost avoided, replacement cost, and substitute cost. This is how much would it cost to replicate manually what the ecosystem service does for us. And this does take place in areas in other countries in Asia. They're pollinating by hand their orchards, and they have to pay those people. So what does it cost, and how much are we willing to pay to manually recreate that ecosystem service? So before I move on to some case study examples, I did want to point out some of the criticisms of ecosystem services and putting a monetary value on nature. It makes conservation reliant on markets that fluctuate. So it assumes all ecosystem services are financially beneficial to people. I don't like this example, but one of the only ones I could find was wolves taking cattle. Everyone knows how important wolves are at regulating prey populations, but for that one farmer, wolves taking his cattle is not financially beneficial to him. If we always put things into the context of economic welfare, officials and the public will always opt for policies that create jobs and economic growth. Because again, it's that self-interest of people. They're always, they gotta provide for their family. And finally, some people simply believe that morality and ethics should be the driving force behind conservation and environmentalism. And I would argue that you can still have both. And then I wanted to point out this is a slide directly taken from a resource, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, the TEBweb.org, I think is what it's called, a really good resource as well. And they just provided some of the assumptions on the process of valuation. So when asking for the willingness to pay scenario, for example, the contingent valuation, we assume that people just hold those values in advance and can easily generate values for ecosystem services, you know, but in reality, we're not educated enough to know to easily generate them. It also assumes that we have the sufficient information and understanding to know what we are valuing, and that we can decide alone on the values that we attribute to ecosystems. And then it assumes that we will value consistently, and we will value according to individual rationality, which just is a huge assumption, and we can't, you know, someone might not care necessarily about a desert ecosystem because it's hot and it's dry, but they really care about their, you know, the mountain that they live on or something. That's an example of that. All right, this is kind of what I like to look at is the current events or the case studies of ecosystem services. And the first one is a whammy. This was a major issue in the early 2000s. So it's kind of an older scenario, but Ecuador was sitting on about 7.6 or $7.2 billion worth of oil. I think it amounted to like 800 million barrels of oil beneath the Yasuni National Forest in Ecuador. And so Ecuador, you know, it knows the benefit of keeping the rainforest intact, and it asks the world to save the rainforest. Will you pay us? Will you pay Ecuador not to cut down our rainforest and drill for oil? And so they were asking for roughly half of the value of the oil beneath their rainforest, and that's about $3.6 billion is what they were asking for. And after 7 years, unfortunately, the willingness to pay scenario, the world came back and could only generate $13 million to save this rainforest. And so Ecuador had to make the decision to drill beneath its rainforest, and they've been drilling ever since, and it's been causing controversy and environmental issues ever since. So it's a sad example, but you know, it also brings to the surface some of the other, you know, hard feelings with ecosystem services. Is that, you know, here in the U.S. and Europe and other nations, you know, we can kind of point to Ecuador and say, Ecuador, you know, the rainforests are so valuable. They sequester carbon. They provide the world with oxygen. They provide habitat. And what about future pharmaceuticals? And we don't even know the medicines that we could obtain from the rainforest. But the reality is that Ecuador, you know, 35% of their population is living under poverty. And, you know, they, as a country, you know, that's not fully developed like the U.S. and other European nations, you know, they want to lift their people up out of poverty. And we can't really tell a country or that they shouldn't do that for their people. Okay, so another interesting example was with the Institute for Policy Research. They looked at 121 villages in Western Uganda, and they split them into two groups. For one group, they would pay them not to cut down their forest. This was in Uganda, trying to avoid deforestation. 60 villages were paid not to cut down their trees, and 61 villages were not paid and received no monetary incentives. At the end of the study, they found that those that were paid cut down 2 to 5% less tree cover when they were given a monetary payment to not cut down their trees. However, those that were not paid, you know, they cut down 5% more of their trees and contributed to deforestation. So overall, what they found was that there's a 2-to-1 benefit between reducing carbon dioxide emissions and the cost of implementing this program of paying villagers not to cut down their trees. So for every $1 you pay a villager not to cut down their tree, you'll get $2 in reward in reducing the carbon dioxide emissions. So just another kind of example or case study of how money talks, ecosystem services, this is a way to value them and to show that they have value. So that Robert Costanza article that I mentioned back in the timeline, what was that all about? What did he say? So the value of the world's ecosystem services and natural capital, they summed it all up, and they found that the entire biosphere was worth a minimum of $33 trillion per year. So that's the entire biosphere, every ecosystem on our planet. And they also estimated that our global gross national product was approximately 18 trillion per year. And that's every nation global gross national product. So that's a pretty, pretty good sum of money there for the entire value of our ecosystem. But they circled back after the study. It did generate a lot of criticism, and people pointed out some, systemic issues within the paper. So they circled back in 2011, addressed some of those issues, not to mention a lot of advancements had been made in how to value ecosystem services by that time. And what they found was that the entire biosphere shot up to a minimum of $125 trillion per year. And that's what I'm talking about. That's a lot of money. That's what I would, sounds about right, 125 trillion. But nevertheless, values are always changing because ecosystems are habitats being lost, things are in decline. But 125, that's a little bit better than 33 trillion. So what did they say? Like, how much are ecosystems worth? This is just a table of some of their values that they put on some of the biomes out there, and the changes between 1997 and 2011. And so coral reefs, those really shot up. I guess people did not really appreciate the value of coral reefs back in 1997, because in 2011, they were worth $352,249 per hectare per year. So coral reefs, they had to reevaluate how much they were worth, because studies had come out showing that they are, nurseries for fisheries of the world's oceans, or they prevent flooding, or, can regulate storms coming in from the ocean like hurricanes and whatnot. Similarly, wetlands and tidal marsh and mangroves were undervalued initially because, not as much research had been done, and people weren't aware of their ability to provide flood regulation or, temper down some of those effects of storm surge and things like that. So just a slide on how much they valued ecosystems at. Now, I don't know what's up with them not valuing anything on desert or tundra, but it must have been a gap in knowledge. They didn't have any values at that time to put any monetary value on ecosystem services in the desert. So here's another case study I like, the Chesapeake Bay. This was a study that they looked at saving a national treasure, what we have to lose. Is it worth the investment? And they found, yes, it is. The commercial seafood industry in Maryland and Virginia generates $3.9 billion in sales for the seafood industry. That relates to $890 million in income for the people of Virginia and Maryland. 34,000 jobs for the citizens of Maryland and Virginia. So yes, saving this bay is an investment, and it's worth it. And another thing they calculated was the effect of the Clean Water Act, a regulation, a policy, and the effect and the monetary value of that regulation on the Chesapeake Bay. And they found that just the Clean Water Act that was implemented in 1972 benefited the Chesapeake Bay by $357.9 million to $1.8 billion. And that's just for recreational boating, fishing, and swimming, not the commercial aspect, just for boating and recreational tourism. Another one a little closer to home, another case study was Corpus Christi, the Corpus Christi Bay. How much is that worth? The Visitors Bureau and the tourism industry in Corpus Christi took a look at how much nature and wildlife tourist activity generates for their local economy. It's $674 million annually, over 50% of the overall visitor spending. This is just for nature and wildlife tourism alone. It doesn't even, account for the fishing and other aspects of ecosystem services the Bay provides, like, mitigating hurricanes or flooding in that sense. So just at nature and wildlife tourism alone, it's worth a lot. And that's all of us going down there, right? To go see the whooping cranes and go maybe on a trip on Mustang Island, go to the beach and see those beautiful waves and do our recreational tourism down there. All right, moving on. So how much is a single species worth? Well, vultures provide a really great case study for this. Vultures in Africa were being poisoned, and this is occurring in other nations as well. It's still a major environmental issue right now. Diclofenac is a medicine for cattle to reduce inflammation, and the cattle benefit from it. The farmers benefit because their cattle, may not die because of the diclofenac, but it causes renal failure to vultures, and up to 99.9% decline in vulture species has occurred. Well, throughout, learning about this, they found that a single vulture is worth over $11,000 just for its cleaning services. And the way they kind of determine this is that vultures within 1 hour can clean a carcass bare before disease spores can form. But when you have no vultures, it increases the feral dog population, rabies automatically shoots up, and not to mention that the feral dogs don't, break down the carcass as readily. It takes several days, which then provides time for disease like anthrax, rabies, and tuberculosis to spread. So a single vulture is worth $11,000 just for its cleaning services, but by halting the spread of disease, they're worth much more to governments and reduced healthcare costs. And not to mention just the fact that vultures deserve to exist and they have intrinsic value and aesthetic value as well. So I like that case study. I think it should be more than $11,000. This is one case study, just pollinators. We're all, we all love pollinators, butterflies, bees, and we all this is the one most well known how much they contribute to our benefit. $29 billion for all of the insect pollinators, not just honeybees, but a $29 billion benefit to U.S. farm income. And 66% of that comes from honeybees, so that's roughly 19.14 million. And when you think about it, and this is what I become concerned with, is that if we were to lose all of our insect pollinators, like our native bees and the honeybees, it begins to become a national security issue. Our food security is extremely important. So this is just another case study on how important insect pollinators were, and scientists putting value on them and monetary value to show and really drive it home to the public how much a single insect can be worth. Another of my favorite examples here, and another ecosystem service that we benefit from immensely in San Antonio, is the Brackenback Cave. It's the largest congregation of mammals in the world, the largest congregation of bats in the world. The Brackenback Cave provides ecosystem service to South Texas farmers. It saves them $740,000 per year in reduced pesticide and insect damage. But in the U.S., bats in total are worth $3.7 billion to farmers in reduced crop damage and pesticide use. So it's an incredible ecosystem service that these bats provide, and protecting bat cave was one of the best things we could do for our city and for South Texas farmers. This is another local study that I wanted to bring up and discuss. The Alamo Forest Partnership looked at the value of tree canopy and the loss between 1985 and 2001. And so I'm just going to toggle back and forth here between 1985 and 2001, and you'll see a decrease in the green in the satellite imagery, and that's the loss of tree canopy. So 1985, 2001. Whoops. 1985, 2001. So we're seeing a lot of green loss in the northern part of San Antonio and around outside of the city boundaries. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is Hardberger Park right here, and that was saved, thankfully, because of Phil Hardberger. So a lot of tree canopy loss between 1985 and 2001. That's a 16-year period, and during that period, we lost 45,000 acres of heavy tree canopy, or 22% of dense forest. And so that 45,000 acres had the potential to remove 3.7 million pounds of pollutants from our local atmosphere, which provides a value of, my screen is kind of messing me up here, a value of $8.9 million per year. So that's a lot. And this is removing pollutants like nitrogen dioxide or nitrous oxide, ozone, that sort of thing, fine particulate matter. They also calculated, the Alamo Forest Partnership calculated that stormwater flow increased by an estimated 73 million cubic feet. So if you put a value, or if you calculate how much it costs to mitigate against that stormwater that would have been retained in the roots and soil of the tree canopy, it costs $2 per cubic foot to build the stormwater drainage systems, you know, those little retention ponds and that you need to mitigate against the increased stormwater flow. And that translates to $146 million. So 45,000 acres of heavy tree canopy is worth, you know, 146 million plus 8 million, a lot, just here in San Antonio. And this was an expansion of the study. It's not as easy to detect the change, but you can see the orange in this image is what tree canopy was lost between 2001 and 2006, so 5 years. In that amount of time, 6% of the tree canopy was lost, mainly in the northern portion of the city where we all know a lot of development occurs. So during that time, 6% tree canopy loss, and that translates to, just in the city of San Antonio, a loss of $490,572 just from air pollution removal alone. And then that stormwater, that's the big one for our area because we do live in Flash Flood Alley. That stormwater value, it's calculated on 64 cents per cubic foot. That's a loss of $37 million in loss. So just in the city of San Antonio, not to mention outside the city. All right, so again, just another case study or another way to look at it, putting value on an ecosystem service, and is what our utilities do, or they provide us incentives to reduce our water bill or shade our houses by planting trees. And these incentives are them, you know, they're putting a monetary value on how much, you know, they're willing to dish out for us to plant trees. And, you know, we really benefit from these services, but it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Why is CPS Energy giving us shade trees to shade our house and reduce our energy? Like, aren't we paying them for our energy? But in reality, it's a win-win situation for both of us. We are benefiting because our energy bill may be reduced with shade trees, but CPS is also benefiting because they can offset future infrastructure costs or maintenance costs for their existing, facilities. And so it's a win-win, and that's why, we see some of these incentives. I wanted to point out a few other notable policies in San Antonio that protect ecosystem services. Our Edwards Aquifer Protection Program with the City of San Antonio, that's the 1/8 cent sales tax that we all voted on several years, that protects our Edwards Aquifer. This is what we were willing to pay as the citizens of San Antonio. They asked and we said, yeah, we're willing to pay 1/8 of a cent of an addition to our sales tax to protect our drinking water. And that amounts to, just in the Proposition 3 back in 2000, $45 million. Proposition 1 in 2005, 10, and 15, $280 million. And this program has protected over 160,000 acres over our Edwards Aquifer in the surrounding areas. So if you haven't seen a visual of that, it's a lot of land. And so this Edwards Aquifer Protection Program is the way the citizens said, we are willing to pay and we want to protect our water. Some other notable policies include the tree preservation ordinance. So, going back to how much tree canopy we've lost, well, we do have a tree preservation ordinance where we can't just simply cut down all the beautiful trees without mitigating in some way by setting aside other land or paying into our tree preservation funds. Also, just simply the Edwards Aquifer Authority Act that was passed in 1993, just to say that we can actually regulate the Edwards Aquifer and protect it. And then one I thought was really a good ecosystem, a good change, and was the San Antonio River Improvement Project. It cost a lot of money, but they increased habitat. They provided a place for people to recreate, and the San Antonio River won the coveted Feast International River Prize doing that. And it's just another way that we put our money where we want it. So normally I would be taking everyone out on a hike through Hardberger Park as part of this talk, and I'm so sad that we can't all be together today. I think it was raining a little bit earlier, so I guess that might be a blessing, but just to kind of reiterate what some of those ecosystem services that urban parks provide would be, just because it's a park or a small area of land, it still removes carbon, it's still providing soil conservation, it's still providing wildlife habitat, water control, air quality. It's providing health benefits to citizens by recreation, community enrichment, education, but also not to mention those values in real estate around Hardberger Park. I'm sure businesses also benefit just by being near Hardberger Park and other greenway areas. The real estate values increase, and they've calculated this. And also the noise reduction and maybe light pollution reduction that a park can provide. Also wanted to point out the Howard Peak Greenway Trail System. We're up to, I think, like 70 miles or more. I mean, it's got to be more than that, but just, a lot of miles that people can recreate around our city. And I just did want to point out that all along these greenway trails, all of the value of those people's property are going up and up. And so the citizens are benefiting from these policies and plans that the city has to increase the green trail system. So I did look at, this is a really cool website called iTree, and anyone can use this. So if you want to jot that down, iTree, you can go, if you have land on your own or you want to just investigate further, anyone can go and use this very user-friendly website to calculate the ecosystem services that their land is providing. So what I did was I put a little polygon around Hardberger Park West, and then the software will ask you to classify random points that it generates for you as tree canopy, herbaceous land cover, or impervious cover like a building or a road. And you do so many points, and as you classify more and more points, the error goes down, right? And so I did that for just the west side of the park, and it provided values of the benefits of carbon sequestration for just the approximately 200 acres on the west side, roughly $38,000 per year sequestered annually in trees. So if Hardberger Park's been in existence for 10 years, and yeah, it became open to the public in 2010, and it's 2020 now. So 10 years, that's multiplied by 10, $380,000 sequestered annually since Hardberger Park's been an official park. And then also the value stored in trees, that's worth $973,924. So the tree benefit estimate for air pollution, when I saw this value, I was like, oh, that's not that much, but really, it is. It's a per year amount, and not to mention it's just that west side of the park. It's only 200 acres, but carbon dioxide removed annually, $6 per year, but in total, $2,192 per year for Hardberger Park West in the tree air pollution benefit. And this is not to mention all of those wonderful cultural benefits that we receive from Hardberger Park. Like the wetland, for example, I don't think the software is accounting for the fact that there's a wetland at Hardberger Park that is a stormwater runoff feature. The apartments nearby, normally I would take everyone on a walk down to the wetland and we would look at it. It's getting some rain right now too, so there may be a buildup of rain in there. But the water that's coming off of the apartment complex adjacent to Hardberger Park has pollution in it, like soaps and oils from people's vehicles. And instead of that rushing down into the stormwater drains and going into the San Antonio River, it's actually being filtered through the wetland at Hardberger Park. And so I did want to point out that I don't think that software is really taking into account all of the ecosystem services that Hardberger Park provides. I think that, the one last thing I wanted to say is Holmes Rolston III was a philosopher and theologian who pioneered the field of environmental ethics and environmental philosophy. And he said, these things, meaning species, count, whether or not there's anybody to do the counting. And I think that that really touches on how I feel about it. Despite them ecosystem services benefiting people, they count. These species count no matter what. And so with that, I will finish my talk and provide a short list of my resources, and the major ones, tbweb.org and the millenniumassessment.org were great resources. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That was really informative. A lot of stuff in there. And Jewell is going to be sharing her slides, so if anybody is interested, you can email her at jewellee.cozort. I'll put the email in the chat here, so we don't have to worry about that. And then also we'll be sharing it on our website as well, so you could stay tuned there. Jewell, we do have a question. Stan and Wendy Drezick asks, are the benefits of expanded savanna areas cost effective?
Cost effective. So when we go out and we expand on savanna ecosystems, I believe it is cost effective and it is worth it because it's increasing the diversity of wildlife in the park. So in San Antonio, historically, it's believed that much of this area was grassland. And so taking it back to grassland is one of the goals of the city. And I do believe it's worth it because we're providing habitat for pollinator species. We're providing a change in the landscape for people to view and for people to appreciate visually. And it is a benefit, I do believe.
Jewell, I have a question for you. Could you speak to some of the stormwater management that is going in on the land bridge? I know that they're going to be...
They are doing stormwater management, but I don't know the details on that, unfortunately. But the fact that it's, you know, we are mitigating against the stormwater, so that it will be retained also to, I know, to water landscaping features. So it's a really great way for us to utilize any water that's captured to prevent, you know, using SAWS water.
Great, thank you. If anybody has any other questions, we have a couple more minutes here. Jewell, what would you say is your favorite place to go into the park to talk about ecosystem services?
Well, I think the wetland is the one that the wetland pointing that out. The amount of water that area can collect, and Wendy did an excellent job setting that area up for stormwater collection. It is going to provide a huge ecosystem service, but also just walking on the trail beneath the tree canopy, the trees sequestering carbon, also providing our oxygen. It's all great.
Great. I have one comment from Patsy Kuntz. She says, thank you for the super overview of the value of ecosystems. I know you didn't have time to speak to some of the possible negatives of value increases due to improved ecosystems. One of those negatives is the gentrifications of areas that abut these improvements when people who have lived in these areas for several generations at a reasonable price find themselves being driven out of their homes because of increasing property taxes as home values grow. So I'm not sure if there's a question there, but do you have a comment on the effects of like, I guess, especially along the Greenway Trail that you were showing, how it's going in different neighborhoods?
Oh, only that I agree completely, yes. And so that is a negative for a lot of people that have historically lived in these areas. And gentrification in general, no matter if it's in an area where an ecosystem is a problem for people in San Antonio and other cities. So I agree with that completely. But I think that is a interesting aspect to look at for ecosystem services and how that might reduce the value.
Thank you. We have another question. Somebody wants to know, can you discuss the benefits or drawbacks of carbon fees and carbon dividends?
You know, I don't know the nitty-gritty details of all that, so I can't really comment. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Great. Well, unless there's any other questions, I think that wraps up our talk today. Thank you very much, Jewell. This was a wonderful talk.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining in. Again, we're Phil Hardberger Park Conservancy, and if you want to learn more about the park and see what other events that we're hosting, feel free to go to philhardbergerpark.org. And with that, everybody have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.